Good morning, everyone. I think we can start now. Thank you very much for coming to this morning session. This panel discussion, which is co-organized by the European Liberal Forum, which is the official think tank of the European Alliance of Liberals and Democrats, based in Brussels, and we're representing almost 50 organizations across Europe working for liberalism in countries both within the EU and outside of the EU. And my name is Maria Alesina. I'm a policy and research officer from the Liberal Forum, and I will be moderating this, I think, very interesting discussion this morning, which is dedicated to a very interesting and controversial topic about the informational space in Russia and how it impacts international affairs, as we all know, quite intensely recently. And we're in the middle of a conventional war, as we all know, and me, myself, as Ukrainian, I know it even better. But we're also in the middle of an information war, which has been lasting even longer than an overt military aggression of Russia against Ukraine. And while Russia might be losing in a military conflict, as we all might see in the last couple of weeks at least, month, Russia is still very strong on the information front. And at least within the country itself, the propaganda machine remains strong enough to keep this aggression even possible, to keep the popular support in the country, in Russia, possible for 7 months to continue the war against another country. And so informational offenses, both within and outside of the Russian Federation, is quite a well-known fact, and it makes a big element of the Russian hybrid warfare. Maybe its most powerful element, and today we will try to reverse the discourse, reverse the narrative, and try to see how the collective West, all the liberal forces within Russia and outside of Russia can gather their forces and try to combat Russian state propaganda. And for that, Russian state propaganda aimed primarily at its own internal audience, which makes Russian external actions possible. So today we have two very interesting speakers with us whose perspectives are very complementary and I think will be very beneficial for the discussion. On the right side, on the left side of me, we have Mr. Ivan Kolpakov, who is editor-in-chief of the biggest Russian independent media, Meduza, in April 2020. Okay. I hope you can hear me. So in April 2021, Meduza was claimed by Russian authorities foreign agent, and it was blacklisted in Russia, and it was since then it has been functioning in exile from Riga. So Ivan will tell us more about that later. The second speaker is Professor Dr. Ryszard Machnikowski, who is the Dean of the Department of International and Political Science at the University of Lodz, and he will provide us with a more academic perspective on the topic, because his expertise includes terrorism, European security, security domain, and transnational relations. So he will have a more he'll have a more academic and theoretical perspective on the topic, but I think we'll have a very interesting interplay between the two positions. And to start the discussion, I would like to give you both one after another the floor to provide your very initial remarks on the context. First of all, maybe we can start with Ryszard, because I have one question to you. I have read an article of yours from 2017 where you said that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine will eventually lead to the collapse of the Russian regime, and you compared Russian aggression against Ukraine to Soviet operation in Afghanistan, and you said that that can be a very similar scenario for the regime eventually, because it just weakens the country. But it was 5 years ago, and I would like to ask you, what's your perception on this issue now when the situation has escalated?
Okay, thank you very much for this question, because, well, not many people in Poland actually know this article. It was published in one of periodicals in Romania in 2017. And of course, I had even a response from the United States at some moment for this kind of approach to the problem. And of course, it was initially heavily criticized because this perspective of the collapse of Putin's regime in Russia was not very close from the perspective of 2016 and 2017, when people who were just involved in the analytical work were perceiving these problems. I was assuming that the conflict in Ukraine, which was frozen at that moment when I wrote it, is going to continue, and at some moment it's going to be hot. It's this cold kind of war, information warfare rather than actually physical kinetic warfare, will suddenly at some point is going to start and transform itself into just normal war like we see today. I was rather skeptical about the year 2022, so I was not expecting that it is coming to so soon. But I was thinking that probably by 2024, 2025, the real war between Ukraine and Russia will break eventually. And this was my second assumption, might lead to the situation that Russia is sliding itself into the position of internal crisis, which may eventually lead to the collapse of the regime and change of regime. But of course, I couldn't imagine the details, because, you know, all this social transformation in such a country like Russia is so complex that you really cannot imagine the specific way of the potential transformation. But from the perspective of 2017, more skeptical voices were seen by me and were heard by me at that moment. But I think that after these 5 years, this article is in a different perspective. So at least one part of my prediction actually materialized. So let's wait for the second part of this prediction, and hopefully we will see the change of regime in Russia. But I don't know when, because I hadn't in a position when it could be when I was writing this article. So, but thank you for noticing it, because it's.
Thank you for response, and because actually you finished your article with a sentence that you don't know when and how it would happen. That there are all the signs that Russian regime would be weakened sufficiently to collapse eventually,
yes.
But the details were difficult to predict, and indeed, as we can see today, there is no contradiction, because I think maybe you meant something else 5 years ago, but on a large scale, it's exactly what's happening, but just maybe through a more intense phase. But Ivan, the next question is to you, and I think through you we can actually move into the domain of information and media. Maybe you can tell us a bit about your experience with your perception of how the information sphere in Russia is currently, what is the state of it, especially you being, you still keeping influence in it from exile. But it would be interesting to hear what are the interplay between the information space inside of Russia and those media which are trying to influence it from abroad.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me here, and I'll try to, I think this is just right now is a very interesting moment with what's happening, in Russian propaganda, in Russian information sphere. Just briefly, I want to introduce myself. I am editor-in-chief and co-founder of Meduza, and Meduza was launched 8 years ago, soon after the Crimea annexation, and when the first military conflict in Donbass was provoked by Russia, and it started from the very beginning from, it started the operation from exile. So it actually started working from Riga in 2014. And I moved from Russia in 2013. So I was we were super pessimistic already at that point. And we were always like, that in Russia it was quite calm. Political situation after after 2014, unlike it was in Ukraine. But we were like, we felt that some huge disaster is coming, and we, used to laugh with each other. Right now, it's not super funny, but like in 2014, we were like this character from some Hollywood movie that stands in the center of Manhattan with the sign "Apocalypse is coming," and no one trusts you, and no one actually can get it. And then the war actually starts, and still it's really hard to accept the fact that it's actually it happens with us, with Ukraine and with Russia, and so on. So I think, unfortunately, that regime is quite strong still. Though when the war started, I also felt that finally, at least, it creates some kind of opportunity. If there is a plus in this situation, then the plus is the fact that maybe regime will soon collapse. But Belarus, provides us very good example of how the authoritarian, contemporary cyber-authoritarian regime can last and last and last, just having two main instruments in its hands. And the one instrument is violence, and the other instrument is propaganda. And propaganda in Russia is sophisticated. This is a very good mechanism that was established decades ago, couple decades ago. And we can talk about Russian propaganda for hours, but I want to underline like some interesting features of Russian propaganda. Well, first, it doesn't try to, to provide, to promote a certain version of truth. It simply destroys the concept of truth. And like this is, and this is super effective because you don't need to create, reality, logic reality. You just need to destroy someone's logic reality. It's very easy. When you can lie, 24 hours a day, it's very easy to destroy someone's logic. Second, of course, Russians and all the people who used to live in the USSR, they have this experience of consuming of the Soviet propaganda. It means that a lot of Russians, when they watch the television, they don't trust the television. Somewhere deep in their hearts, they understand that this is the manipulation. Probably, in some ways, it is lie. But it's so easy for that isolated society to, like, how does like normal and average person thinks? Yes, this is we are certainly understand that it is lie what we see on Russian television, but what we get from abroad is probably the same lie, but from our enemies. So we would prefer to trust our own version. It's easier. And also another interesting feature about Russian propaganda is that it actually provides you a feeling that there is a discussion. Like when you watch Russian television, you all know, you've seen these YouTube videos when some Russian crazy political talk show where people yelling at each other and punching each other. And like, so when you watch Russian television, you feel that there is a competition of ideas, but like what kind of ideas are competing? One idea is to go and use nuclear tactical weapon right now, right away. Or the other option, the other idea, no, we shouldn't use nuclear weapon yet, let's just do conventional war. Like that kind of discussion. Interestingly, at some point, like the last feature of propaganda created a huge problem for propaganda. Because when the war started, they turned on like the biggest button they had. They let the propagandists use all the arguments explaining the invasion to the people, because when the war started, everybody, I think we all felt that it's going to be really hard to explain to Russians why on earth Russia actually started a war against Ukraine. It is impossible. So then they used all the propaganda machine to explain, to to express, to show that the Ukraine is full of Nazi. I don't want to repeat it, like all this crap that actually was created on the television, like, and the so-called party of the war took the main position on the television. And then Russia started losing the war. And then this like constructed discussion started converting into some kind of real discussion. What we see right now in Russian, controlled Telegram channel and Russian television is that, propagandists aren't happy about the situation in Ukraine. And I think like at some point, it looks like they lost control on the propaganda machine. I don't think that it can't be fixed, but it's hard to fix. Because when you use all your propaganda machine during 7 months to convince people this is the war and we are winning, but in fact we are losing the war, something goes wrong. And I don't try to give any prognosis, because I don't try to give any predictions, because I thought that the war will never start. When the war started, I thought that Russians will go to the streets and will protest. It didn't happen. So like I don't know. I don't have any predictions. But I think this is very interesting moment to observe.
Thank you very much. I think it's indeed obvious that propaganda is, without propaganda, all of this wouldn't have been possible. That's why, in my perception, it's really one of the strongest weapons which Russia has had, not only for decades but for centuries, because propaganda has been strong in Tsarist Russia, it has been super strong in the Soviet times, and that's why it's so good now, because the tradition is indeed very, very solid. And if I myself watch it for 5-6 hours Russian TV, I will believe it, honestly, because it's really well made and it's very consistent, and it's indeed easier to believe because it's a very convenient version of reality, especially for Russians who want to see themselves as a great, strong country. But the question is it actually possible to find a way to intervene into this very powerful discourse, since Russia is an authoritarian society which has never had actually an experience of freedom, which lasted for more than 10 years, and indeed genuine pluralism of thoughts has actually never existed, because it's a very limited scope of ideas which can actually be publicly expressed. And from your perception, maybe from historical perspective, from other countries as well, is it even possible to try to intervene with the informational alternative version of reality in this information space of authoritarian controlled society? And Ryszard, maybe I will start with you here, because also read another article, I already told you about it, that there is a very interesting comparison of how during the Reagan regime, Reagan rule, the United States tried to intervene with the Soviet propaganda by supporting the movement of Solidarność in Poland. And since we're in Poland, I think it will be interesting for the audience also to hear your perception of whether that experience can be useful in this context, especially because of your way of comparing.
Okay, I will try to answer this question by referring to the subject of today's panel, which is how to provide the information offensive in Russia. And I would like to make a couple of bold statements in this, because this historical example of Reagan versus Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc is very interesting, and we can learn a lot kind of things from that, but I do not think that it can be transferred just directly, because we are having completely different situation now than we had, for example, in the 80s, in the 70s, when the solidarity movement was started to grow. And I'm very skeptical towards the subject, actually, and we just before this panel I've said it. Basically, I do not believe that we can be offensive in the infosphere of Russian state for a couple of reasons. First of all, we do not have means. we basically can affect, for example, internet, and of course Russians are having access to the internet, but I do not think that the influence of this medium is going to be really kind of decisive in this way of transforming minds in Russia towards the truth, because there is constant lie, but the other side is saying that all sides are lying actually. The West is also lying. This is Western propaganda against our propaganda, and we try to stick to ours because it's simply more safe for us Russians to do it. And this is a very important statement. And I think that the state control of media in Russia is at such level that we simply cannot affect it directly. I would tell you about a kind of a story where I was spending my holidays in a very close to a very beautiful city, Czech city of Karlovy Vary. And you should know about Karlovy Vary that it is not only a very beautiful city, but it is very frequently visited by Russian tourists. And they are living in, like in many other places. So they were walking the streets, they were entering cafes, they were drinking coffee, wine, and they were served by sometimes even Ukrainian waiters or waitresses. They were welcomed very warmly, and they went to their hotels when they had television, and this was Czech television and satellite television, so you cannot say that they did not have access to this Western propaganda. They should not only watch the Russian television, but they can easily watch CNN, BBC, Sky News, or whatever. It didn't affect them. This is my claim. Either if they have contact with this Western infosphere, yes, it doesn't mean that it can affect to much extent this mind which is polluted by this Russian propaganda. The second important thing is that the West is not thinking that it is in a position of war. Of course, it is supporting Ukraine very actively with military means, of course, but I do not think that Western minds are really tuned to the idea that we are actually in a war against Russia, because this is a very scary idea, and people want to refute it because you do not know what is going to happen in future, whether we are going to be in direct contact, military contact with Russia, and how might it end, nobody knows. And people are simply scared of this situation. So we do not have even the skills, but because the skills from the 80s and 70s under Reagan in the 80s are forgotten. The West was very clever in kind of information warfare against Soviet Union, because it had an opportunity to train a lot since the 50s or 40s even, late 40s, when the Iron Curtain actually was declared by Winston Churchill, and the West was in tune with the idea that actually it is against Soviet Union. Of course, it was not direct military conflict, but it was an information warfare. So we had the West, yes, had the time to learn a lot about it. But my guess is that all that was forgotten, simply forgotten. After 1990, after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, when Russia was considered to be just a normal state, maybe a very peculiar, but just normal state, which is actually supporting the global affairs, and it is going to do the business with the West. So why should we take care of them? All these specialist institutes, for example, in the special services, but also in civilian and academic sphere were closed because there was no more need for specialists in Russia. People were not learning Russian because, well, if you cannot understand the language, how can you understand the mentality of your potential enemy, and so on and so on. So my second claim is that we simply not only do not have means of influence, but we do not have enough skills. We have to learn a lot from the current situation. Mm-hmm. So just not to talk too much, so maybe these 2 points, if I may say.
Thank you very much, and your points made me think of why that experience with the US supporting Solidarność was actually successful. First of all, because there was already a critical mass of people in Poland who were unhappy and who were ready to fight, and then just a little bit of support made it possible. And the second point is also because apparently it was successful because it also didn't come overtly from the West.
Yes.
It was the West in a hidden way supporting what was happening already in Poland. And that's why maybe that the key for success, a critical mass of people, if we translate it into Russian context, critical mass of people has to be uncomfortable with what's happening, plus the message should come from Russia's own sources, even if it's supported by the West, because otherwise it might provoke the opposite reaction. And at this point, I would like to ask Ivan.
If I may add
yes.
just to what you have said already, because there is a difference between Eastern Europe and Russia. Between Poland, Czech or Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Russia, and we are actually true by saying that it was a completely different process of building opposition, for example, in these countries, especially in Poland and Czechoslovakia. So there was a critical mass. So the influence of, for example, Free America or other broadcasters, American broadcasters, they were having direct influence because it was quite normal in Polish homes that you have listened to them, even if they were actually, well, prevented by the authority. The influence of Svoboda, Radio Svoboda in Russia, was not at that level at any time, even in the late 80s.
And indeed, yeah, that's why we can ask Ivan, because Radio Svoboda, for example, is still active in Russia. And what is your perception on whether these 2 points are even possible in Russia today, and from your experience?
I think, well, this is a very interesting topic, and I, of course, agree that the way of functioning of the opposition in Russia is completely different than it was like in 1980s in so-called Eastern Bloc. Like, let's talk about Radio Liberty, for example. First, of course, when we talk about current media situation in Russia, the USSR comes in mind like automatically, because right now, all the independent media were forced to leave the country. Like there is zero independent media are actually based in Russia right now. All the independent information, if you want to get independent information, you are in Russia. You go to some media organizations that are based outside. This is like the only way to get reliable, relevant information about the current situation. Like it looks really similar to what we had in 1970s or 1980s, when all the so-called enemies' voices were broadcasting over the USSR. But there is one huge difference, and between now and then. The Soviet people had at least one good reason to listen to Radio Liberty, because otherwise, they probably wouldn't. The only one huge reason is rock and roll. And yeah, that's the truth. And like people, because when you listen to Radio Liberty, you can't actually change anything. Like, this is super depressing. There is a friend of mine, she's older than me, and she grew up in a small, in the countryside. So she, she had a normal Soviet family. They shared normal Soviet values. They did not oppose the authorities. They were just, conformists, normal Soviet conformists from some village. At some point, she was a teenager. She goes to Moscow to her relatives, and her relatives in Moscow are Russian intelligentsia, and they listen to Radio Liberty and stuff like that, and they say, "Hey, listen, check this out. This is Radio Liberty. You're gonna love it. You are a teenager. There's rock and roll. Listen to Radio Liberty. You're gonna have fun, but don't tell anyone." So she listens to Radio Liberty, and she learns that everything is so bad in the USSR. Like, there are huge lines. It's really hard to buy a television, a TV set, or something like this. Like, there is a deficit, etc., etc., etc. So, like, they were super critical on the Soviet reality. Why wouldn't they? And then she said, like, wow, if the USSR is such a bad place, what's going on the West? It might be a disaster to live there. Because, she grew up in the reality of, this is the best place in the world. She haven't seen anything but USSR. And now she understands that, yes, she can compare what she learned from the Radio Liberty with what she sees. Yes, this is true, but what's going on there? And like this is, it means that Radio Liberty wasn't super effective in terms of, you know, convincing millions of Soviet people. And now is more or less the same. If you're an average Russian person and you're watching Russian television, like 20% of Russians traveled outside of the country. It's like something completely different from Ukrainians. You guys were traveling in tents throughout recent years, especially. Russians, they just don't have this experience. They don't know what's going on in Europe. It's so easy to manipulate them, to convince them that, you know, Russia is probably the last truly Christian civilization and all of that. But at the same time, like there is another. This is another time. This is another period, historical period, and then there is a there is a real independent media environment, and it is still influential. Like I wouldn't say that we can easily reach out the majority of Russians. It's just not true. It is impossible. But we can reach out to a lot of people. For example, Meduza, as many other media organizations, was blocked in Russia a couple weeks after the invasion started. And it was a really damaging moment. And we lost significant part of our audience in web. However, few hours later, we have updated our app, and it contains anti-blocking tools. So you can be in Russia, you can read Meduza without any limitations. All our platforms, they were growing like this. And by this October, I think the scale, the size of our audience is now the same as it was before the war, despite we were blocked in Russia. So it means that actually there is a huge demand on independent information, and it is very easy to consider Russian society as a monolith from the outside. I mean, yes, it's going to be really hard to change the situation. There is a huge inertia in Russian society, but it is not a monolith. It consists of different fragments, different parties, different communities. It is very complicated in terms of, for example, media consumption. So you can work with different parts of this society. And I would say that I wouldn't even say this is my experience, because we don't have proper sociology. We can talk about it like for another couple hours. What are the real sociology in Russia right now? But in my experience, and I'm working with huge audience, with huge Russian audience that's still based in Russia, I don't think that the majority of Russians is actually supporting the war. I think this is the minority. And but of course, Vladimir Putin is happy that we all think that the 80%. Like, have you seen this last sociological survey about the support of the annexation? Like 80%, it is said, supporting the annexation of for Ukrainian territories. It's bullshit. I just don't believe it. It's not at the top of agenda. Like, if you go to the street in Russia and ask any person, do you want Kherson in Russia, in Russian Federation? Nobody cares about it. Absolutely. Everybody wants the war to be stopped, and that's it, more or less.
That's actually a very interesting point. So what is then the it's simplistic way of putting it. What is then the problem? Because Russia is a huge country, and of course the number of people who could actually gather together and suggest a different position on international affairs than the one suggested by Putin. From Ukrainian side, it looks, you are so many, why can't you change things? But of course, it's a question of political culture and everything. It's not only a question of information. But I think when we're speaking about information and propaganda, then the question is, who is the target audience of these alternative messages, which we would like to promote in Russia? Because I think those 20% who traveled to Europe from Russia, they are maybe exactly those 20% who are reading Meduza. Before war, after war, so basically these people, there is no need to convince these people. The question is more about those 80% who are either hesitating or just don't care, which is probably even worse. And then my next question would be, who would be the target audience of, no, maybe we should start actually, what would be the alternative messages which need to be promoted in Russia, which need to be suggested to the Russian audience, which could actually have the potential to change the situation? Shall it be, for example, if we're speaking about informational offensive, can it be, for example, information about the number of Russian soldiers who are actually dead in Ukraine? Because according to Ukrainian statistics, it's up to 70,000 people who have died in the last 7 months. So can it be some sort of shocking information, or shall it be some sort of analytical information? What kind of messages need to be delivered to the those 80% of Russian audience who are still on the rather neutral side?
If this is a question for me, I can honestly say I don't know, because I do not have enough knowledge about these internal rifts in Russian society. Definitely there should be some segments which are very prone to hear to these news and to absorb it. But I do not think that we can have really huge impact on the majority of society. Definitely I can agree that the most of Russians not actively support war, but they remain silent, and this is enough. So this is the question about the person who was just before us here in this room, the very first panel, and there was a meme, Ukrainian meme, showing the Iranian women protesters in the streets of Tehran and other big cities, and there are no such equivalent in Russia. So I think that this is the huge difference. So honestly, I cannot say, because it's very difficult, but I would like to make a point towards the West, because it would be really very huge success from the Western side if we stop supporting and helping Russians in spreading information offensive to the West. What I'm meaning, what I'm having in mind, there are outrageous speeches and some kind of informations which are coming from Russia, which are actually making familiar to each and every person who is actually interested in the problem of Ukrainian war. For example, former President Medvedev is telling outrageous things, and when he just finished writing something on Twitter, I know it because Polish, American, British, French, and German information agencies instantly are informing me what President Medvedev has just said outrageously. This is a huge mistake, because what is the most important thing from propaganda? The broadcast, yes? The means of broadcasting it. The Russians shouldn't even care about the broadcasting of their own messages to the West, because the West is doing this for them. So they do not even have to make offensive information offensive to the West, because actually it is done by the West itself. If you remember, for example, the very beginning of war and this pre-war period, January 2022, December 2021, when the American sources were telling, you know, it's going to start. Yes, the Russians are going to invade Ukraine. What was the message from the American side? I was observing it very carefully. Ukraine has no chance. The size of kind of advantage, military advantage of Russia over Ukraine is so that in 3 days they are going to take Kiev. This is defensive, and this is really very, very damaging for Ukrainian people, because if you are hearing from CNN that in 3 days Russian troops are going to walk the streets of Kiev and you have no chance because your army is not effective, which is not true actually what we see today, it is really strongly influencing the minds of people who have to be sure that they can actually defend itself. So sorry for switching a bit point, but I think that it is quite important to say.
It is indeed quite important because I think there was also always perception from Ukraine that the only way to change actually the internal discourse in Russia would be indeed through just military defeat of Russia, because that's the only fact which Russians cannot ignore. If Russia loses, it loses, and it's for this 80% of people who are actually agreeing on social contract with Putin that you provide us with a message that we Russians are great, we are ready to provide support to you. This is actually Russian defeat in its war with Ukraine actually will be a factor which can ruin the whole system. But in that regard, again, coming back to the information space, Ivan, do you think there are messages which can actually help in the process towards getting there? Because I think Ukrainian armed forces doing their part, but can we prepare somehow the field so that this moment, if it happens, hopefully if it happens, can actually be turned into something positive for Russia itself?
I think this is $1 billion question, $1 billion question. Of course, if we all would know what will, it never happens like that. It's like in the in the commercial when the television tells the truth and millions of people are running to the streets and changing the regime. Normally, it doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, you can tell the truth and it doesn't change anything, or it actually. We know how the journalism works. Normally, people prefer not to accept unpleasant truth. That's why propaganda is so effective. It manipulates. It tells the people what they want to hear, and the journalism simply doesn't. So I think that it's a big question. First, I think that with Medvedev and other Russian mad politicians and their furious speeches, like this is a classic trap. It happened in the States with Donald Trump. Like Donald Trump was so disgusting that, and his every quote was so disgusting that all the media covered it intensively, and eventually he won the elections. Like we can talk a lot about it. It's not that simple, but yes, he became a huge media figure because he was super attractive, because of his actually, not simplicity, but because he was saying so strange things every day, and it's so good thing to cover for any journalist. It's interesting. He was very interesting. Like the same with, I think with Dmitry Medvedev. Of course, he's covered because the trajectory of this politician is insane. Like he started as a liberal, as the most liberal, governor of Russia for centuries, and now he's like the most conservative and the most furious Russian politician. Why does he do that? I think he just tries to survive in his own circumstances, not because he wants to be covered that much by international media. But this is another story. So I think that in general, Ukraine actually is winning informational war internationally. Of course, Ukraine looks. You can't even compare. In Western media, it won, I think, on 24th of February, and then Zelensky did his amazing job as his incredible PR strategic person, and of course he looks so much better than Vladimir Putin. It's not that hard to look better than Vladimir Putin, but like Zelensky is on the top, and I think like in general, on international level, yes, the war is won. What should we do with Russians? This is a very difficult question. I think you make a mistake when you think about this situation as like when you try to find some similarities with 1980s, especially with Eastern Bloc. it's something completely different. Probably it's German situation of the mid-20th century. Like when Germany lost its war, we wouldn't say, if you research, if you learn the sociology of that time, you will definitely see that like the majority of Germans, they are not Democrats, they are not Western-looking people. They probably even still support the regime that just collapsed and destroyed their country. So I think that, of course, I don't like historical parallels. It always brings you to some place you don't want to be at, actually. But you know, it's not going to happen like that. That we will show the truth. We will tell the truth to Russians. We will tell how many people died in Ukraine, how many Russian soldiers died, and it will change everything. No, I don't think that it's going to be like that. It would be too simple. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk to Russians. There is, as I already said, like a lot of people, they do not support the war. They remain silent. This is really bad. But it means that there is a chance that maybe they will reconsider the situation. Maybe. And we need to provide them as much information as possible. Good information, relevant information. We shouldn't try to fight against Russian propaganda with propaganda tools. I am, as a journalist, as a liberal, I don't think that it is the right way to do. I think what we need to do is to support real journalistic organizations, and they will do their job. They will, you know, keep these people informed. Plus, there is a minor part of the society that is strongly against the war, and they also need, they have to be supported, and they have to be informationally supported. And if we, like, there is a very small chance for a better future for Russia. Unfortunately, I think, like, Russia destroys itself right now. But if we believe that there is a chance for a better Russia, we need to support these people who are strongly against the war right now, who are participating in anti-war movement, though it's super dangerous, who are running from the mobilization. Even these people are our allies in Russia. And they have to be fully equipped with independent information. This is my belief.
Yeah, indeed, it's just a question of in which terms our thinking, short-term perspective or long-term perspective, because of course long-term perspective, it's more complicated, it's more complex, and that's what we need to do if we want to change something eventually. But the question is also, I think it will be my last question, then we might give the floor to the audience if you have some questions. my last very, it's egoistical, I'm just curious about it, because we talked about independent media, but speaking about state media, Первый канал, for example, this funny episode which happened on the first Russian channel, you all probably are aware of that, when a TV presenter, a very famous TV presenter who has been promoting propaganda for quite some years, Marina Ovsyannikova, she entered into live stream with in the first days of war with the slogan "No to War," and then she was fired or fined, and then she moved to the West. And I'm still curious whether, Ivan, your perception, whether you think it was something staged or it was a genuine informational offense. But because from my perspective, there is no live stream on Russian state channel, so I'm curious how.
My answer won't be super simple. Like as a person, as a journalist, as an immigrant, as a refugee, I don't like these. I don't have any sympathy to these people that were propagandists for years, and now they realize that something goes wrong, and it turned out that they are against the regime, and they are, coming out as the opposers of regime. So for example. Recently, we tried to hire some person who will do some social media management, SMM, or something like this. So and hundreds of people applied from TASS agency and RIA Novosti, another state agency. And I was like, no, guys, you will never work here. Why did you decide that in 2022, when the war started, it's time to finally, do something with your life, stop working for TASS agency? You were never, it was your choice. And if you gotta be absolutely, stupid not to see what you are actually doing. Pardon. From the other side, I think that every every important person from propaganda that comes out with anti-war message right now, actually it is very important for the society. Like Ovsyannikov's action, I think, was much more effective, unfortunately, than the actions of the activists who are doing some anti-war, stuff right now, because she could, because it was bright. It became a story immediately. I think it changed a lot, and it was really powerful. Though, like, personally, emotionally, I don't get it. I don't believe it. I don't like it. I mean, where were you? Like 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 8 years ago, in 2014, when Russia took Crimea, where were you? Were you thinking about your Ukrainian relatives? But in terms of, anti-war movement in Russia, I think it's very good.
So technically it was possible that it actually happened without...
I think it wasn't.
It was not staged.
It wasn't staged.
Okay.
No, I don't think
Already
so.
good to know. So thank you very much. And if anyone from the audience would like to, you'll be given a microphone.
Hi. Sorry, my throat is giving in. Thanks so much for the great panel. I'm really interested in the topic as I represent Google. My name's Machnikowski, and we have this little platform called YouTube, which quite fascinatingly is still available to Russian citizens. I believe you have your channel on YouTube as well. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on both the role of platforms such as Google and YouTube as windows? This is how we see it. It's one of the few windows both for us to peer into Russia, because there are still people making videos in Russia. Of course, they need to be careful about what they say, but still, we get pictures of what's going on inside and some commentary. But also, as you said, it's at least one of a good channel which is still quite relatively open for the Russians to actually access independent information. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on the value and the role? Maybe you could fill us in. Why is the Russian government still allowing us to be open? Because we've removed quite a large number of both their channels and specific pieces of information which we found just misleading and against our policy. So I'd be grateful for any thoughts and advice on how we do things, and maybe things we can do better to remain open and a source of reliable information for the Russian people. Thank you.
I don't have any insights, unfortunately, about the fact that Russia did not block YouTube so far. YouTube is one of the most important, one of key platforms that are still accessible in Russia, and there are a lot of very good professionals, journalists that are working for YouTube specifically. And they are broadcasting in Russia, and they also have huge audience in Russia. And also important political figures using YouTube to provide, their ideas. For example, Alexei Navalny, who is now in prison, like, he's the biggest oppositional figure in Russia. He also has super popular YouTube channel, and probably he published the most influential investigation on Russian corruption during the last few years. I think there are few reasons why they didn't do it. First reason, they can't replace YouTube, and they use it as a propaganda tool. Of course, because they need to work with just like all of us, they think about the segmentation of the audience. they think how to reach out to younger people. And they create a lot of content for YouTube. And also there is a huge industry that gets money from propaganda made on YouTube. And they are the lobbyists. I think RT is one of the biggest lobbyists of YouTube in Russia. RT, Russia Today, is not interested in, banning YouTube because not indirectly they produce a lot of stuff for YouTube. Some controlled bloggers, and they, of course, they steal a lot of money on that. And this is how it works. Also, I think that they are a little bit afraid because Google is a very important infrastructure for Russia. Like Russia is a country of Android phones. So if Google responds, and Google can respond, in these circumstances, maybe it wouldn't be true in 2021, but now it's 2022. And probably Google can somehow respond to the activities of Russian authorities if they will try to block YouTube. And probably they trying to calculate the risks. I think the risks are critical in terms of infrastructure. And one last thing I want to say, I think that the technological companies that decided to stay in the country, despite this huge process of running, businesses running from Russia, and I completely get it. But if we're talking about internet, tech companies and infrastructure, they should stay there because, like, I can give you just one simple and quite funny example. Like 1 year or 2 years before the invasion started, Spotify started working in Russia. And Spotify, which is one of the biggest, stream services, music services in the world, is also a service that, you can listen to podcasts on Spotify. And when Spotify is leaving the country, you actually are losing one of the platforms that can be used for the distribution of independent content through podcasts. No one thinks about it. Like I think it was very emotional step from Spotify. They said, like, they very quickly they said, we are shutting down an office. Spotify won't be accessible in Russia. Okay, we totally get it. We understand it. Of course, you want to stop the operation in Russia. But this is a critical infrastructure for, distributing independent information. And I think it's a big question whether, at least we need to discuss it before you actually destroy this infrastructure in Russia. Because eventually it leads to the reality where Russians have no other options but the propaganda.
I totally agree with Ivan, but my main argument here is that they are just using these platforms for their own purposes. So this is probably the reason why you are still there.
If there are any more questions, we have time for one more.
Dzień dobry Państwu, Marcin Adamusiak, obywatel.
Good afternoon, Marcin Adamusiak. I represent nobody, but
czytając tak, jak zapewnić ofensywę informacyjną w Rosji, zapytałbym, jak zapewnić skuteczną ofensywę informacyjną w Polsce, na Węgrzech, we Włoszech, w Hiszpanii, w Szwecji, jak zapewnić skuteczną ofensywę informacyjną w Stanach Zjednoczonych. Wszyscy rozumiemy, co mam na myśli, prawda? Jak zamienić ofensywę
the media offensive that do not promote patriotism but promote nationalism without understanding these exclude each other. One sounds beautifully, the other sounds like shit. But that doesn't apply to Russia only. It affects the whole world. Yesterday I wanted to ask, because we frequently hear the word populism. populism is the narrowing of the topic. It should be used in the context of nationalism, and nationalism is present worldwide. Still, we are progressing towards authoritarian regimes. Finally, how to convert democratic elections based on the Polish example, because the election can be democratic. How to turn democratic elections to elect democratic governments? How can you have the situation that the Polish president is the constitution raper? How could we change this information status?
Question to Ryszard, because it was in Polish. And very briefly, please.
Well, it's a bit. We are going in different direction from the main subject of today's panel, I guess. I do not want to compare, for example, Italy, even Hungary or Poland with the situation in Russia, because as we have already heard, the majority of information sources are state-controlled in Russia. It is still not like there in the West, and the access to this kind of alternative information is still available there. The question is, what is the broadcast, what are the ideas, and why these ideas are not affecting people to such an extent that they are just forwarding this nationalistic movement. This is a very deep question. And it affects the whole globe. In fact, as you have said, it is really true that it is not only the question of Russia, it is a question of Europe, but we are going outside Europe. But I think that we are just running out of time, so sorry for not going deep into answering this question, because the organizers can kick us out, so sorry for just brief remarks.
Thank you very much for being so brief. And yeah, I think I'm afraid we have to finish, but I hope it gave you food for reflections, food for thoughts, and thank you very much to our amazing speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for an invitation. Thanks a lot.